about things, but just a little bit of something to keep it steady. Okay, so we're going to get into the meaty topic of the week. And I'm calling this talk, Your Thoughts Are Not Facts. And we're going to dig into the being mindful of our thoughts. And I want to start it out with a couple of like little talking points, things that I want us to start thinking about, and it's a definition of a term that I'm going to bring up over and over. And so in case some of you might not be familiar with the term, I'm going to explain it. And if you want a little bit more information, just wave your hand and ask a question and I'll try to explain it. But what we're wanting to do as we start to move into being mindful of our thoughts, we discover early on in meditation, and we're working with our thoughts, that we actually are quite identified with the content of what we're thinking in our mind. And so we actually think that the thoughts are us. But as we kind of tease our way into it, we're going to use this concept that I call, we want to become the observer of our own experience. So if you kind of play around with this little mind game a little bit, when you're thinking and you're seeing your thoughts in your mind, what is that consciousness, or who is it that's actually watching your thoughts? Is it you, or is it somebody else? So, my personal answer is that part of you that's conscious of the thoughts that are happening, that is actually watching those thoughts happening, that's the higher you. That's the, for lack of a better term, the divine, the infinite intelligence you, the part of you that really truly loves you and doesn't really doesn't have a negative thing to say about you. It's a higher level of consciousness, higher intelligence. I'm sure that at some point neuroscientists are going to come and say that it's some portion of our brain operating at a higher level, watching all the other parts of our brain or something. They're going to have some scientific explanation for why we can watch our own emotions and our own thoughts play out. But from the perspective of us working with mindfulness of thoughts, we want to start to develop this notion that we can stand outside of ourselves and look in and watch without any attachment, without any emotional response, without any preference to what's going on. To look at it and say, without any passion, that's a pleasant thought, that's an unpleasant thought, that's worry. We want to start to develop some detachment from the stuff that's going on up here between the two ears. So if I've confused you, wave your hand. If I haven't confused you, we'll move on. I'm going to start. I'm just checking to make sure there's no waving hands. We're going to start with a story. And it's a story from Pema Chodron's book, The Wisdom of No Escape, How to Love Yourself in the World. And she tells this story in her book about this woman who's in the jungle and she's running away from tigers. And she runs and runs and runs, and the tigers are continuing to get closer and closer. And she comes to the edge of a cliff, and she has nowhere to go. But she sees some vines leading down the cliff. So she climbs down the vines to get away from the tigers. But as she gets about halfway down the cliff, she looks down and she sees some tigers at the bottom of the cliff as well, waiting to eat her. So she's kind of stuck there, and she looks back up and she sees a mouse at the top of the cliff gnawing on the vine that she's clinging to. So she's surrounded by danger above and below. And she looks over and she sees a small patch of strawberries kind of, growing just within arm's reach of her in the cliff. So she takes a look up, sees the tigers and the mice up there. She looks down, she sees the tigers below, and she just reaches over, she grabs a strawberry, and she pops it in her mouth. And what I actually take from this is that we have a choice in how we respond to life. We're constantly going to be surrounded by unpleasant experiences or scary experiences or triggering experiences that stir up emotional and mental content in our mind. But we do have a choice on how we're going to deal with it. But before we can, really kind of develop some skill on how to respond to these things, we first have to become aware of what the content of our thoughts really are. So I'd like to start with just a really brief exercise. You don't have to do anything special. You can just sit in your seat. What I'd like you to do is for 30 seconds, we're going to close our eyes. And what I want you to do is just observe and count how many thoughts you have in that 30 seconds. Okay? So I'm going to start with ringing the bell, and I'll end with ringing the bell. Have you had a thought yet? How about now? Is counting thinking? How many of you had some thoughts? Just raise your hand. Okay. Great. So predominantly, a lot of us had thoughts. It's what our mind does. It's natural to think. And it reminds me of this cartoon that I dug up when I was first writing this talk a few months ago. And it shows two monks in there sitting on their meditation pillows, and one sitting there, with his eyes closed, all erect, and the other one is sitting there, and he's kind of leaned over and he's whispering to the other one, "Are you not thinking what I'm not thinking?" And what I like about this is it really kind of points to even for people who've been meditating for a very long period of time, find it very natural to be sitting there in complete silence, meditating and thinking. Thoughts still come to us as we meditate. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of thinking. Why does our mind think? Well, let's take a look at how we're kind of wired. Our human brain is the center of all thought in our brain. It contains around 80 billion neurons. And it only accounts for about 2% of our body weight. But there's some other interesting information here. There are neurons distributed all over our body. There are 40,000 neurons in our heart, 100 million neurons in our stomach and our gut, There are neurons in almost every major organ in the human body, the liver, the kidneys, the gallbladder, sex organs. So these neurons are responsible for carrying information from all over our body to our brain. So our brain is wired to gather information and do something with it. So we are constantly being bombarded by stimulation and circumstances in our interaction with the world that get transmitted to our brain, and our brain is then evolved over time to process that information and create responses. And with the human brain, all of this information is then collated, and it starts to generate patterns in the neural matter that change into a stream of thoughts. Neuroscience over the last 15 years has done a lot of investigation into the nature of thinking. And some of the interesting statistics are that an average person has about 60,000 thoughts a day, which is roughly 42 thoughts a minute, or roughly one thought a second. That's a lot of thinking. But as they dug into it in 2005, there was a couple of great reports released by two universities. And the summary of both of these studies were the following. 80% of our thoughts are negative thoughts. And 95% of the thoughts were repeat thoughts, i.e. we've had them before and we're just revisiting them again. Anybody identify with that one? And 85% of our thoughts of worry are about things that will never happen. So, in conclusion to both of these studies, hey Chris, I see your hand is raised. Do you have something? Okay. All right. So the conclusion from both of these studies were that 97% of our worrying thoughts were baseless and were resultant from unfounded pessimism and perceptions of who we are and where we are in the world. You're going to hear a lot about Pema Chodron in this talk, so you're going to understand that I've kind of fallen in love with her. She quotes in her book, When Things Fall Apart, the most difficult times for many of us are the ones that we give ourselves. And what I think she's pointing to is we have all these thoughts, a lot of them are negative, and we are creating our own suffering. But if we take a closer look at negative thoughts and we try to really get an understanding of what's going to happen from all these negative thoughts, we have learned from neuroscience that negative thinking affects our brain and our body in one main way. It generates a lot of cortisol and adrenaline. These two things come together and they break down our hippocampus, which is the center of our brain that helps us form new memories. The more cortisol we release in response to negative experiences, it becomes increasingly more difficult for our brain to create memories. And over time, what we find is we have a harder and harder time to form new, joyful, wholesome, and healthful memories. So the content of what we're putting down into our permanent memory storage is largely starts to turn and tilt towards the negative. So that kind of brings me to the hot topic of the overall class and to our current state of the world. Is the question is, how does all of this really kind of get impacted by our current daily experience, the world that we're living in right now, as we're contending with unemployment, loneliness, and the effects of the coronavirus? How does all this get affected? Well, if you take a look in the world around us and you just kind of tune into the news and the media outlets, it's an unrelenting coverage of all aspects of negativity, specifically around the coronavirus. Just before coming to the class, I just took a quick scan of the headlines, and here are three that kind of stood out to me. Coronavirus may never go away, even with a vaccine. Deaths cross 100,000 in the U.S. Where will it end? This one is even better. NASA unveils plans on how to stop a virus from outer space. I mean, how much more alarming, negative, scary stuff can they throw at us? When we combine that with our response to trying to take care of ourselves and the people around us by social distancing and staying at home, we're seeing this, basically it's an epidemic of loneliness. The American Psychological Association say that the risks associated with social isolation are basically loneliness, and loneliness can lead to long-term fight or flight stress signaling in our brain, which negatively impacts our immune system. And simply put, people who feel lonely have less immunity and have more inflammation built up in their body, so they're sick. They literally become sick. Human beings are not meant to be alone and isolated for long periods of time. We evolved as communal animals. So the current state of the world is kind of leaning into creating a situation in our body and in our minds that is causing us to lean more into this negativity bias that our mind already does naturally. But when we really look at it, each of us as individuals has an overwhelming desire to be at ease and to experience joy and happiness. I would say that a large number of you came to take this class in order to find a little bit of extra ease for yourself. The question that we need to ask ourselves is, how can we generate more ease and joy and happiness when we are constantly being bombarded by negative thoughts? You know, my proposition is that we need to change the balance of the thoughts in our mind from a negativity bias to something that's a little bit more wholesome, healthful. And that takes a little bit of practice. But before we can get to changing the direction of our thoughts, we need to be able to identify them and see them and begin to work with them. As human beings evolved, we evolved a set of responses and areas of our brain so that we could stay alive and keep us from being hunted by our enemies and by wild animals. And quite frankly, our mind is wired to always favor the negative thoughts. The fight or fight response is really hardwired into our brain. As I said in earlier talks, but we don't live in that kind of a world anymore. Largely, we live a very safe life. We're not constantly needing to protect ourselves from being hunted down by wild animals or raving enemies on the warplane. So this part of our brain is potentially overactive. Which brings us to our practice. When we first sit down and we get quiet and we work with our breath or start to scan our bodies, our nervous system starts to calm down just a little bit. And we start to see things happen. And often students, and I've heard this from several of you already, that as we've sat and gotten quiet, what we notice is many of us can't stop thinking. And it's really almost difficult for us to rest our attention on our breath or the sensations of our body, because the brain wants to get involved and start doing something. So there was a talk recently by Eckhart Tolle called Transcending Fearful Thoughts. And what he was trying to get at in his talk was how do we move from a state of negative thoughts into a state of wholesome and healthy thoughts. And he has this to say in his talk, quote, "All it requires is a little bit of awareness, the awareness of what is going on in your mind. To recognize but not identify with what is going on in your mind. It is a background awareness of what is going on in your mind." In other words, I would say he's saying that we need to develop mindfulness of our mind, or thoughts being thought by the mind. And this is where my kind of introduction comes in. We need to develop this notion that the thoughts are happening, but that's not who we are. And we're actually the part of our consciousness that's actually observing that process of thinking happening. So this is where my instruction and my encouragement comes. And this quote is one that comes from my therapist, Dr. Donovan. And he said to me once in one of my sessions, "I encourage you to become a dispassionate observer of your own experience." And what he was trying to encourage me to do is don't get involved in what the thought is. Get outside of your head and don't allow it to draw out an emotional response. Don't try to get involved in the story. Just watch the story play out. Both Jack Kornfield and Tara Brach use this kind of terminology when they give instructions. They instruct people to become the loving awareness that is the observer of the thinking of the mind. And I think the reason they use the word the loving awareness, a loving awareness really is a kind, you can almost think of the loving awareness as the kind grandmother or kind grandfather who always was nice to you as a kid, or some kind person who was nice to you throughout your life, who's there just taking a look and not criticizing, not judging, not applying any labels, good, bad, or otherwise, to what's going on inside of you. So, I know this sounds a little bit weird, because I'm telling you that we should become aware of our thoughts while we're meditating. And oftentimes, we in the West have this misconception that meditation is the absence of thoughts. We think that in order to be a great meditator, we should have no thoughts whatsoever. And the reality is that even great meditators have thoughts when they're meditating. It's really how we deal with those thoughts that is the skill that we're trying to build here. There's a cartoon of a monk who's sitting on his pillow, and he's got a birthday card in front of him, and the bottom of the panel says Zen birthday card, and the thought bubble over his head as he's opening the card is not thinking of you. A little bit of humor. So what this is actually saying is this is a state of mind that we can achieve when we're meditating. But it's not the only state of mind that can arise when we're meditating. And more often than not, we're going to be thinking. So there are going to be plenty of thoughts that are going to take us on a ride while we're meditating. And the goal really is what do we do with them? So when we start to examine our thoughts, the mind is just going to spontaneously throw up thoughts without any sort of encouragement. We're going to want to just will those thoughts away, and they're just going to come unbidden. And thoughts come to us in many different forms. They come to us in words, images, ideas, visions, memories, fantasies, plans, you name it. And for some of us, when we start to have this breakthrough, this realization about all of this stuff that's going on inside of our head and all the different ways our mind thinks, we become aware just how identified we are with our thoughts. And what I mean by that is, if you think about how you describe yourself, and I will use my own example. In the past, I used to describe myself as somebody who worries because I had worrying thoughts. So I labeled myself as a worrier. So I became identified by my thought stream. It locked me in as a person who worries. But it's a thought. It's a thought arising in my brain. But if you looked at me from the outside, would you say there's a worrying person walking by? But as we kind of get so drawn into the inside of our head and we start living almost exclusively inside of our head, all of the noise and all of the thoughts that are constantly running through our head become a universe unto itself, and we actually believe that is the universe that we're actually living in. And as we talked about last week, what's happening right now is what's happening right now with our body. The body sitting here on the chair, the cool breeze blowing in the window, the sun on our face, the smells in the air. That's the reality. What's going on inside of our head is, at least inside my head, is mostly delusion. And so when we become warm and fuzzy and cozy with all of those thoughts and start to be able to identify them for what they are, we gradually become unidentified over time and with practice with the content of those thoughts. And that is where the very first step of liberation comes. Because when we can start to tease apart our identity, who we are, from the content of our thoughts, we begin to see how our beliefs and the way we perceive the world are distorted through our own thoughts. That the world actually doesn't match up with the way our mind is processing it. And I told this story last week, but I kind of want to bring it in again. I discovered that particular aspect of mental thinking when I went to one of my very first talks in Dharma Sits in San Francisco, and Eugene Cash was giving the Dharma talk. And somewhere towards the end of the talk, he said the following 5 words: "Your thoughts are not facts." And for the person who I am, one who's kind of rooted in math and science and has a engineering degree, that was a really difficult concept for me to wrap my mind around, because I really believe that everything in my mind was a fact. Because after all, how could I be an engineer if I wasn't a factual thinker? But as I really kind of reflected on it in that moment, I could see the majority of my thoughts were not facts. And that was a huge aha moment for me. So one of the ways we can work with our thoughts is, I like to kind of use different analogies. When you're looking at your thoughts, I like to think of them like a train, and me, the dispassionate observer, the kind and loving awareness that's observing the thoughts, is like a pedestrian standing by the side of the railroad tracks that the train is riding on. And the engine of the train is the brain, and each of the cars behind the train is a different thought. And so if you look at the train, one thought is connected to another thought, is connected to another thought, is connected to another thought. So as the train is going by, and if we are the observer, the kind attention, the kind awareness that is looking into the mind and looking at the thoughts as they're flowing by, what we're wanting to do is just kind of look inside the train car to see what's going on, but not get on the car and get involved. So as the train is going by, the very first cart might be a planning thought. I've got to go to a birthday party, what am I going to wear? The next car comes by, I wonder who's going to be at that party. Next car comes by, maybe it's a worrying thought. Oh, I forgot to feed the cat. You've got these cars just going by. Each car has a different thought in it. What we're wanting to do is to not get on the car, to not get involved in the story of the thought. So we just want to kind of peek in and take a look. But all too often, it happens. We all get caught in this. You step out of the position of the observer, the kind observer that's just kind of taking a look and saying, oh, I see what's in there, but not getting in. And we get in to the car. And this is where we step out of a sense of a presence, the sense of awareness, and we get lost in the train of thought. Because what happens when we get lost is we get involved in the story. There's an emotional content, there's something that is very sticky and alluring about a particular thought that we just can't resist but getting involved with. And before we know it, one thought has led to the next, to the next, to the next, and the next. And at some point, you realize you're thinking. And this is the miracle moment. At that point where you're realizing that you're thinking, you have this opportunity to get off the car. And, you step off the car, and if you're lucky, you only traveled a couple hundred feet down the tracks. If you're like me, you wake up a few miles outside of Burbank. So the invitation is, we want to try and allow for ourselves to get lost in thought. When we realize that we're lost in thought, and we come into that moment of awareness, oh my God, I was just thinking. Step off the car, see where you're at, and take a look. Get yourself back to a place of being grounded and start over again. One of the easiest ways to work with thoughts in this fashion is, like I said, oftentimes the mind likes to be given a little bit of a task just to kind of keep it engaged, but not so much that it gets drawn into the thought. So we like to practice with thoughts in the following fashion. We use a technique called labeling, which is, as you see the thought coming by in the car, just label it. That one's a judging thought. That one's worrying. That one's a fantasizing thought. That one's planning. And just, apply these generic labels to whatever it is. Don't, the minute we start to describe it as a fantasizing about XYZ, we're getting caught in the story. So you just want to just lightly apply the label. I always kind of mentally see it as taking a Post-it and sticking it on the car as it goes by. Because, as I said earlier, thoughts are super sticky. They want to draw us into the narrative. It's in spiritual circles, we would describe this as the ego trying to draw us in and get us involved in the narrative. But as I said, once you get on the train, we've lost our awareness and we are no longer just this kind observer to what's going on. So that's kind of like the beginning of building the muscle of how to start working with thoughts. The next topic we'll move on to is, I think, the kind of the juicier topic, which is how do we start building some momentum to get our mind to kind of move more in the direction of joyful, healthful, easeful thoughts. And much like the woman who was being chased through the jungle by the tigers, who's clinging to the vine on the cliff, make a choice to eat a strawberry, even when we're surrounded in a moment by a lot of danger. Because when we start doing that, we're starting to develop a steadiness that we can derive some peaceful stability in our life at any moment, regardless of what the content of our life might be, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. And in that choice to move always in a healthful, more stabilizing direction with our thought process, we're making a choice to arrive in the present moment. Okay. So we're going to move into some exercise. So I'd like everybody to get yourself situated so you're sitting comfortably. We're going to do about 15 minutes of guided meditation, and we're going to do some practice with working with thoughts. And hopefully you guys will have some thoughts. If you don't, then just sit with your breath. If you're feeling comfortable and safe with closing your eyes, please close your eyes. Otherwise, you can just lightly, drop your lids so that there's just a little bit of a gap, and soften your gaze so you're not really focused on anything, and look maybe slightly down in front of you. At the end of the meditation, I'll ring the bell. So let's take a few moments here at the beginning to settle in and feel our body. Last week, we got interested and curious about the experience that we were sensing through all the senses of our body. And this is an easy way for us to arrive right now and focus our awareness. Maybe take a few breaths. Settling into the present moment, settling into this body, settling into this breath. When you're ready, and if you're feeling comfortable with these next suggestions, let's let go of our anchor of awareness, whether it's the breath or the body or both. And as we let go of the anchors, the things that we've been practicing with for the last couple of weeks, we're going to try to remain present. And as we let go of the anchor, we're going to move more into the domain of thoughts and feelings. And the thoughts are going to be the center stage of our practice. Watch with curiosity at the thoughts as they arise moment by moment. There are many kinds of thoughts. Thoughts of past, future, planning, worry, or fantasy. As you see these thoughts, treat them as momentary soap bubbles floating by, to be observed as they drift by in the breeze. Each bubble drifting by with its own thought content. Some of them floating away into the distance, and others popping or evaporating, soon to be replaced by another bubble. Pay attention to the stream of thoughts, each in its own bubble, without being distracted by the content or the emotion of the individual thoughts. Rest comfortably, observing the bubbles as they drift by. Let the story associated with each of these thoughts stay encapsulated safely inside of each of the bubbles. Thoughts and feelings associated with those thoughts can be observed and felt as events in our field of awareness without judgment. Everything is acceptable. Nothing is rejected. Thoughts spring from your mind without any assistance. Nothing has to happen. They just arise. Thoughts are just like bubbles. They're temporary and impermanent. Instead of facts or truth, regardless of what the content of the thought is or the emotional charge, no matter how urgent this thought might present itself or how often it shows up, it's still temporary and impermanent. Thoughts may be pleasant or seductive or unpleasant or repulsive or even neutral. Neutral thoughts are so subtle, they may be really hard to even identify themselves as active thoughts. Like you would treat a bubble. Observe each of these thoughts with a light touch, with very, very light attention. We don't want to break the bubble. We don't want to go inside. We don't want to touch it. Just lightly move up and get cozy to it as you look inside. But don't get caught inside the bubble. Try to relate to the content of each thought bubble as if it were as equal importance and relevance as to maybe what the color of your shirt was 3 weeks ago on Tuesday. Thoughts may want to be very compelling or enticing. But even if it is a compelling or enticing thought, don't jump in. Just treat it with some dispassion, some kindness, some gentle awareness. Oh, I see you. And let it go. if you find yourself getting caught in a thought stream, you'll see points of views, opinions, ideas, beliefs, plans, memories, stories, and we notice how they explode and continue to give birth to more and more thoughts. We get lost and swept away by the breeze with the bubbles. If you notice you've been swept away, temporarily lost, carried away in the cyclone of your thoughts, simply return to your anchor of the body or the breath. Find some steadiness. Refocus your awareness. And if you're feeling steadied and resourced, go back to observing those bubbles. Or if you're maybe not feeling like you can do it, it's okay to simply continue to work with your anchor. Do what feels right to you. This practice of observing our thoughts, these bubbles, without judgment, without getting entangled with the thought or the feeling that comes along with it, allows us to gain greater awareness of what the content of our thoughts is, what is on our mind, and what feelings may fill our heart. Welcome.